Okay, so in today's tutorial, I'm going to go over the drawing fluid process and how to use drawing fluid to create hand-painted stencils into your screens. So I'm just going to start off right here and show you guys what I've got going on here. So I have my screen right here. It's clean. It's degreased. You can sort of see that there's some stainage in there from other projects. That usually happens after you've used your screens for a while, but it doesn't mean that it's dirty or anything. It's just stained from the previous ink that you've used before. But my screen is clean and free of any sort of light blocking or ink blocking debris that might have been in it. I've got my screen attached to my little hinges here. That way it doesn't move around while I'm working with the drawing fluid and painting my image out. And now I'm going to go through the materials that you're going to need for this process, and I'm going to show you a little more of an up close of my setup down here and how I've got my drawing set up and my screen set up to create my stencil in my screen. Okay, so I'm going to go up to my screen here. Underneath my screen, I'll lift that guy up, I have my drawing. This is the drawing that I'm going to be using for my reference for my stencil, This is the drawing I'm going to be using for my reference for my drawing fluid layer. I've got some little snails that I've already screen printed on here, but I want to add some cattails and little wispies in the background, and I'm going to be using that drawing fluid to paint those in to kind of create like a little painterly effect. So I've got my drawing, as you can see, taped down to my printing surface. I'm using my little white printing board here, and on top of my drawing I have a piece of acetate that is also taped down over top of my drawing. So you want to make sure that you are protecting your drawing at all times when you're doing this process, because the drawing fluid can easily bleed out onto your drawing if you're not careful. So make sure that you have a piece of acetate covering your drawing. That way you don't get it like stuck to your screen or get any tears in your drawing or any like mess ups or mishaps. So over here I've got some blue tape and I've got some paintbrushes of various sizes. I'm going to be using some relatively smaller paintbrushes because the imagery that I'm using is not necessarily like super detailed, but requires smaller paintbrushes. So you can use paintbrushes of any size that you have. You can also use different textures like sponges or Q-tips or like rags and stuff. You can also use your hands and create like handprints and fingerprints with the drawing fluid. So the possibilities are endless, but for this tutorial I'm going to be using just regular old paintbrushes. So over here I've got my drawing fluid and my screen filler, which are both going to be super important for this process. So I'm going to go ahead and talk about the drawing fluid. We've got the old Speedball screen drawing fluid here. It's a nice thick goopy substance. Here, I'll show you guys real quick. So if you guys can see in there, it's all blue and goopy. It's kind of like syrupy and runny. It's mostly just sugar and sugar water, so it is kind of like a syrup, and you can use this process, this drawing fluid process, with other materials such as like soap or gum arabic or any other water-soluble and dissolvable liquid. But we're just going to be using the classic drawing fluid from our friends at Speedball, and this is what I'll be using to paint out my screen. Over here is my friend's screen filler, and I'm going to be using this to coat my screen once I am done painting out my screen with the drawing fluid. So other materials, I've got some blue tape, a rag, and then I've got a little cup of water to help thin out the drawing fluid when it gets too goopy. Okay, so back over here at my drawing, you can see here that I've got a little paintbrush that I'm using to prop my screen up. I'm going to lift my screen back down. To to prop my screen up so that way it is not touching directly onto the surface of my drawing or my printing table. This will be super important for when you guys start painting out your screens, because that drawing fluid gets really sticky and can easily stick, like I said before, to your drawing or to your printing surface. So you want to make sure that your screen is propped up at all times while you're doing this, to ensure that you don't get your screen stuck to your table. I'm just using here a tiny little paintbrush because I want my screen to be as close to my drawing as possible without touching it. That way I can get my registration to be as crisp as I can possibly get it. So I'm just using a little paintbrush to prop up my drawing. You can use like a roll of tape, or you can use, I don't know, anything really. Just make sure that your screen is not touching your table surface. Okay, so now what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna go ahead and start painting out my image with the drawing fluid. So I'm just using a really small amount of drawing fluid. You don't need to use a bunch of it, so you don't have to glob it on there. And I'm just following the lines of my drawing and filling in those spaces with the drawing fluid. So you can be as detailed as you want with this, or you can be as general as you like. I like to, I don't know, try to get some detail through this process. So I'm gonna go ahead and paint out my cattails and little plants here. And I'm gonna play around with different textures, with different lighting, see where I can add some value into my project here. And yeah, so I'm just, like I said, I'm gonna go ahead and I'm gonna paint in the rest of this, and then afterwards I'll show you guys the next step, and then we'll talk about how to complete and finish this process. Okay, so here's the final result. As you can see, I've got all my little cattails painted in here. It took me about, I guess, like an hour to paint in all my little cattails here and some little stippling and stuff that's going on in the background. So what I'm gonna do now is I am going to let this dry in front of a fan for about 15 to 20 minutes before going on to the next step. So the next step after your screen has dried with the drawing fluid on it is we're going to coat the screen with some screen filler, and we're going to use our scoop coat right here. So I'm using the Speed Bulb, just regular old screen filler. It's this red watery substance. It's really, I don't know, once this stuff dries, it's kind of hard to get out of like your clothes and things. So make sure that you guys are wearing an apron or not wearing nice clothes while you're working with this. I have a rag to help clean up any messes or spills, which I got some crusty stuff already on the table. And then I have my scoop coat here. And I'm using a scoop coat that is a little bit larger than the size of my image that I painted in with my drawing fluid, but that is a little bit smaller than the size of my screen, because I still want my scoop coat to press up against the mesh of my screen and not the metal frame. So this scoop coat here is going to be wide enough to cover my image, so this is the size I'm gonna choose. So what you're gonna wanna do then is take the screen filler here and you're gonna fill up your scoop coat with just a bit of screen filler. You don't need a whole bunch. For those of you who might have already done the photo emulsion project, screen filler is a lot runnier than photo emulsion, so a little definitely goes a long way. So my scoop coat here has about, I don't know, I only filled it up like a quarter of the way full, and you can see that it's all like whoosh, all runny and stuff. Make sure that you guys shake the screen filler, so shake the bottle before you pour it. It does separate a little bit, so you want to make sure that it's mixed up really well. And then, like I said, I wouldn't fill it up more than this. You could probably go halfway, but if you put too much screen filler in there, then it's just going to be a pain when you go to coat your screen, and you might put the coat on way too thick. So this is probably a good amount. To coat my screen, again, there is a sharp edge on my scoop coat here, and then on the other side there is a blunt edge. I'm going to be using the sharp edge here to coat my screen, so that way I can get a nice thin coating of screen filler, because we don't need a lot of screen filler in order to cover our screen and to block out any of the areas we don't want to print. We just need a nice thin even layer. So I'm going to be using the sharper edge of my scoop coater here, and then I'm going to go over to the floor over here and I'm going to start coating my screen. Okay, so down on the floor here I've got my screen resting in a ledge down here that's created for coating screens. So if you're at home and you don't have a support to put your screen in, it does help to make sure that your screen is supported while you're coating it. That way it doesn't move around and wiggle around while you're trying to coat your screen. So you can either make like a little ledge like this, or you can prop your screen up between like two books or something, or two pieces of wood, or two like heavy objects to make sure that it doesn't move around while you're trying to coat. So I'm going to just stick it in the middle of the ledge here, maybe a little bit more towards the side. And then the back of my screen is resting up against the wall. So as you can see here, I'm coating my screen on the flat outer side of my screen. You don't want to coat on the inner side, because that's going to give you a lot of headaches and it's going to be more trouble than it's worth. It's definitely a lot easier to coat on the flat side of your screen. So make sure when you guys are coating your screens, Whether it's for this process or for for photo emulsion, you want to make sure that you are coating your screens on the outer side here. So I've got my scoop coat here that's filled with my screen filler. I'm going to press this sharp edge up against my screen, and I'm going to start down at the bottom of my screen on the mesh. I'm not starting on the metal frame, I'm starting on the mesh of my screen, and I'm going to tilt up my scoop coat until this blue edge here is lined up directly against my screen. I'm going to wait for all of the screen filler to be touching the screen, and then with just firm pressure, you don't have to press super hard, I'm just going to pull up quickly and cover the entire surface of my drawing here. So, and then at the top, I'm going to let the excess screen filler fall back. As you can see down here at the bottom, some of it gooped out. So I'm just gonna go back over it as so. And yeah, and that's how you coat your screen. So I'm going to clean up my mess on the floor here. Screen filler is a little, I don't know, like I said before, it's messy, okay? So it gets everywhere. So I'm gonna clean up my mess down here. This is a good amount to be coating on your screen. You don't want to coat any more, any less. If you do get some huge globs on your screen, you can always just run back over with the sharp edge of your scoop coat and just scoop it up without pressing up against your screen. So after you're done coating your screen, you're gonna want to let that dry for about, again, like 10 to 15 minutes or until it's dry to touch. And then after the screen filler is completely dry, we're going to take our screen to the washout sink and we're going to just rinse out our drawing fluid areas, and hopefully our stencil will come out the way that we want it to. So it's important to make sure that you clean out your scoop coat and your little squeegee after you're done using it. I'm using some simple green and I'm spraying it in my scoop coat here. And I'm going to use a little green scrubby sponge to just scrub out any of that excess screen filler. So I'm filling it up with water, and then I'm going to thoroughly scrub it all out and make sure that everything is nice and clean. So now that my screen filler is dry, I have taken my screen and I've put it in the washout sink here. If you're doing this at home, you can use like your bathtub or a wet sponge with just water. And I'm going to just gently rinse out the areas that are filled in with drawing fluid until all of that drawing fluid has fallen out and all that's left is my stencil in my screen. So now that all the drawing fluid has been rinsed out, I'm going to just check it real quick. I'm going to put this screen back in front of the fan to dry, and after it's dry, then it's ready to print. And that's how you do the drawing fluid process.